The headlights carve two pale tunnels through an ocean of darkness, and beyond their reach, America disappears. It's 3 in the morning on a Tuesday, and you haven't seen another car in 40 minutes. The white lines tick past in hypnotic rhythm. Your radio crackles with static between stations, catching fragments of distant voices before they dissolve back into noise. The highway stretches endlessly forward and endlessly behind, and somewhere in this vast emptiness, your mind begins to play tricks. Was that a figure standing just beyond the shoulder? Did something just move in your peripheral vision? You grip the steering wheel tighter and tell yourself it's nothing, but the unease settles into your chest anyway, familiar and primal. This feeling, this particular species of dread that blooms on lonely highways in the small hours, is something millions of Americans know intimately. Our nation is stitched together by more than 4 million miles of paved roads. 4 million miles. To put that in perspective, that's enough asphalt to circle the earth at its equator over 160 times. These ribbons of concrete and tar connect our cities, traverse our wilderness, bridge our rivers, and tunnel through our mountains. They are the arteries of American life, carrying commerce and families, dreams and desperation across unfathomable distances. But these roads, remember, they've been built over indigenous trails that carry travelers for thousands of years before European settlers arrived. They cut through battlefields where soldiers bled into the soil. They pave over forgotten cemeteries, abandoned settlements, and sites of unspeakable tragedy. And everywhere the highways have gone, the stories have followed, collecting along the shoulders like roadside memorials, passing between travelers like folklore has always passed, from one voice to another in the dark. This is a journey into those stories. We're going to travel America's most haunted stretches of highway, exploring the legends that refuse to die and the experiences that defy easy explanation. We'll meet the witnesses, examine the history, and ask the question that lies beneath every ghost story. What truth are these tales trying to tell us? Whether you believe in the supernatural or approach these accounts with skepticism, the highways themselves are real, the fear they inspire is genuine, and the stories, well, the stories have a way of getting under your skin, especially when you're driving alone and the sun has long since set. The headlights cut through the darkness of Highway 666, illuminating nothing but endless asphalt and the skeletal shapes of juniper trees bent by desert winds. For decades, drivers along this stretch of remote New Mexico roadway reported encounters that defied explanation, experiences so similar in their details that they formed a pattern too consistent to dismiss as mere coincidence or imagination. The highway earned its notorious reputation long before the paranormal stories emerged. Officially designated U.S. Route 666 in 1952, the numerical designation alone was enough to spark unease among the superstitious. The biblical association with the number of the beast cast a long shadow over the isolated two-lane road that stretched through the high desert country of northwestern New Mexico, cutting through Navajo Nation lands and passing through communities where ancient stories mingled freely with modern folklore. By the time the Federal Highway Administration quietly renumbered it as Highway 491 in 2003, the road had accumulated enough strange tales to fill volumes. The vanishing hitchhiker phenomenon along this cursed stretch of pavement reached its peak during the 1980s and 90s, when dozens of drivers came forward with accounts that shared an uncanny similarity. These weren't vague ghost stories passed down through generations. They were first-hand testimonies from contemporary witnesses, people with addresses and phone numbers, individuals willing to sign statements and speak to investigators about experiences that left them shaken and searching for rational explanations that never quite materialized. One of the most thoroughly documented cases occurred on a frigid November night in 1987. Thomas Whitfield, a long-haul trucker from Albuquerque, was making his regular run from Gallup to Shiprock when he spotted a figure standing beside the road just past mile marker 63. The details of Whitfield's account, recorded in a statement he gave to the San Juan County Sheriff's Department 3 days after the incident, paint a vivid picture of the typical encounter. The figure was a young woman, Whitfield reported, wearing what appeared to be a light-colored dress completely inappropriate for the near-freezing temperatures. She stood motionless at the edge of the pavement, her thumb extended in the universal gesture of a hitchhiker. Whitfield later told investigators he felt an overwhelming compulsion to stop, despite his company's strict policy against picking up riders. He pulled his rig to the shoulder, and the woman climbed into the passenger seat without saying a word. According to Whitfield's testimony, the hitchhiker was in her early 20s with long dark hair and pale skin that seemed almost luminescent in the dashboard lights. When he asked where she was headed, she spoke only once, giving him an address in Cortez, Colorado, roughly 90 miles north. Her voice, he said, sounded distant and hollow, as though she were speaking from the far end of a long tunnel. She wrote the address on a scrap of paper she pulled from somewhere in her dress, handed it to him, then turned to stare out the passenger window at the darkness rushing past. Whitfield drove in silence for what he estimated was 15 to 20 minutes, occasionally glancing at his unusual passenger. She never moved, never turned her head, just continued to gaze out into the night. He was approaching the small community of Biclabito when he decided to attempt conversation again, asking if she had family waiting for her at the Cortez address. When she didn't respond, he looked directly at the passenger seat. It was empty. The truck was traveling at highway speed on a straight stretch of road with no turnoffs, no places where anyone could have exited the vehicle. Whitfield slammed on his brakes, bringing the 18-wheeler to a shuddering stop in the middle of the highway. He checked the passenger seat, the sleeper berth, every compartment of the cab. The woman had simply ceased to exist inside his truck. The only evidence of her presence was the slip of paper with the Cortez address written in neat, old-fashioned script, and the passenger seat, which was inexplicably damp to the touch despite the dry desert air and the truck's running heater. Whitfield sat on the shoulder for nearly an hour, he later reported, trying to rationalize what had happened. Had he fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed the encounter? But the paper was real, clutched in his trembling hand. The damp seat was real, cold and wet beneath his palm. The following day, still disturbed by the experience, he filed his report with local authorities. The deputy who took his statement noted that Whitfield appeared genuinely shaken, showed no signs of intoxication, and had a spotless driving record spanning 2 decades. The investigation that followed revealed details that only deepened the mystery. The address in Cortez led to a modest house that had belonged to the Montoya family since the 1950s. When investigators made contact with the family, the elderly matriarch became visibly distressed. Her daughter, she explained, had died in a car accident on Highway 666 in 1964. She had been hitchhiking home from a dance in Shiprock when she was struck by a vehicle that never stopped. Her body was found near mile marker 63, not far from where Whitfield reported picking up his mysterious passenger. The woman had been 23 years old, with long dark hair, and according to a faded photograph the mother produced, she bore a striking resemblance to Whitfield's description of his vanishing hitchhiker. Similar accounts emerged with disturbing frequency throughout the 1980s and 90s. In 1992, a couple driving from Farmington to Gallup reported picking up a teenage boy near the tiny settlement of Sheep Springs. The boy asked to be taken to Gallup, mentioned he was trying to get home, and then disappeared from their back seat somewhere between Newcomb and Tohatchee. The couple found the rear seat soaking wet, despite the fact that it hadn't rained in the region for weeks. A comparative analysis of these Highway 666 encounters reveals a consistent narrative structure, a pattern so regular it suggests either a genuine paranormal phenomenon or a deeply embedded cultural script that witnesses unconsciously follow. The encounters almost always occur at night on isolated stretches of the highway. The hitchhiker appears suddenly, often near mile markers associated with fatal accidents. The figure is usually young, dressed inappropriately for the weather conditions, and communicates minimally, often providing only a destination or address. The disappearance happens when the driver is distracted or looking away, and physical evidence is sometimes left behind, most commonly in the form of wet seats or handwritten addresses. Psychologists studying the vanishing hitchhiker phenomenon suggest these stories tap into deep-seated anxieties about isolation, vulnerability, and the thin line between the living world and whatever might lie beyond. The lonely highway at night becomes a liminal space, a threshold where the normal rules of reality might temporarily suspend. The act of picking up a stranger represents both compassion and risk, a moment when we make ourselves vulnerable to the unknown. When that unknown transforms into something impossible, it strikes at our fundamental need to understand and control our environment. But the phenomenon extends far beyond the desert highways of New Mexico. Route 44 in Massachusetts has generated its own collection of vanishing hitchhiker accounts with remarkably similar characteristics. The highway runs through Plymouth County, passing near historic sites and old colonial settlements where tragedy has left its mark across centuries. In October of 1989, a Taunton woman named Patricia Greenwood reported an encounter that would haunt her for years. Driving home from visiting family in Plymouth, just after midnight, she spotted a young man in what appeared to be old-fashioned clothing standing beside Route 44, near the Middleborough town line. Despite her initial hesitation, she pulled over when the figure made eye contact and gestured for help. He climbed into her car and asked to be taken to an address in Raynham, speaking in a formal, oddly cadenced manner that Greenwood found unsettling. As she drove, Greenwood attempted conversation, asking if he'd had car trouble. The young man simply stared ahead and said he needed to get home, that he was expected. When Greenwood glanced down to adjust her car's heater, she felt a sudden drop in temperature so severe that her breath became visible in the air. When she looked back at the passenger seat, it was empty. She pulled over immediately, checking the car frantically. The door locks were still engaged. There had been no sound of a door opening, no rush of outside air. The young man had simply vanished. The investigation into Greenwood's experience, conducted by local researchers interested in paranormal phenomena, uncovered historical records that added a chilling dimension to her account. The address the hitchhiker had provided, which Greenwood had memorized in her distress, corresponded to a property where a young man had died in the 1920s. He had been walking home from a social gathering when he was caught in an unexpected winter storm and froze to death, attempting to reach his family's house. The clothing Greenwood described matched the period photographs of the deceased man with unsettling accuracy. These stories persist because they resist easy categorization. Skeptics point to the power of suggestion, the influence of folklore on perception, and the fallibility of human memory, especially under stress or in conditions of reduced visibility and fatigue. The human brain, they argue, is remarkably adept at filling in gaps, creating coherent narratives from fragmentary sensory input, and conforming experience to familiar cultural patterns. A driver who knows the legend of the vanishing hitchhiker might unconsciously shape an ambiguous experience to fit that template, transforming an ordinary encounter with a confused pedestrian or a momentary hallucination brought on by highway hypnosis into something supernatural. Yet, the physical evidence occasionally left behind, the wet seats and handwritten addresses, the consistent details across accounts from witnesses with no apparent connection to one another, these elements complicate the dismissal of such stories as pure fantasy or misperception. The witnesses themselves, often professionals with stable lives and no history of making sensational claims, risk ridicule and skepticism by coming forward. What compels them to report experiences they know will be doubted? The vanishing hitchhiker represents something profound in American folklore, a ghost story perfectly suited to our car-dependent culture and our complex relationship with the open road. The highway promises freedom and possibility, but also isolation and danger. It connects us to distant places while simultaneously removing us from community and the familiar. On these lonely stretches of asphalt, particularly at night when the world reduces to headlights and darkness, the boundary between the mundane and the mysterious grows thin. The stories continue even after the official renaming of Highway 666 to Highway 491. Reports still surface occasionally from drivers traveling that route through the New Mexico high desert, though whether the frequency has declined or simply the willingness to report has diminished remains unclear. The road itself remains unchanged, still threading through vast empty spaces where cell phone coverage fails, and the nearest town might be 50 miles in any direction. Still a place where the unexpected could happen, where a figure might appear at the roadside, thumb extended, waiting for someone to stop. There are roads that locals avoid after dark. Roads whispered about in diners and gas stations, where the bartender leans in close and tells you to take the long way home. In northern New Jersey, winding through the heavily forested hills of West Milford, Clinton Road has earned a reputation that extends far beyond typical urban legend status. This 10-mile stretch of crumbling asphalt has been called the most haunted road in America. And what makes it particularly unsettling is not just one ghost story, but an accumulation of phenomena so varied and persistent that even skeptics find themselves pressing the accelerator a little harder when driving through. Clinton Road begins innocuously enough at Route 23, but as it snakes deeper into the woods, civilization falls away with startling abruptness. The forest here is old growth in places, dense and dark even on sunny afternoons. The canopy overhead blocks out much of the sky, creating a permanent twilight along certain stretches. There are no streetlights. For miles at a time, there are no houses, no driveways, no signs of human habitation whatsoever. It is remarkable, really, that such isolation exists mere miles from suburban developments and strip malls. Drive 15 minutes in any direction and you will find shopping centers and coffee chains. But here on Clinton Road, you could be 100 miles from anywhere. The road itself is treacherous even without supernatural considerations. It twists and turns with brutal suddenness, many curves unmarked or poorly marked. The pavement is often in disrepair, cracked and potholed, with shoulders that drop off into steep wooded slopes. There are no guardrails in many sections. Over the decades, these curves have claimed numerous lives, and it is perhaps no coincidence that the paranormal activity seems concentrated at the sites of the worst accidents. Dead Man's Curve is the most infamous location along Clinton Road, though locals debate which curve actually deserves the name. Some insist it is the sharp bend near the bridge over Clinton Brook. Others point to a particularly vicious S-curve about 3 miles in from the southern entrance. What everyone agrees on is the legend of the Ghost Boy. According to the story that has circulated since at least the mid-1970s, if you stop your car at Dead Man's Curve at midnight and throw a coin into the woods or the water below, the coin will be thrown back at you. Sometimes it hits your windshield. Sometimes it lands in the road beside your car. Sometimes you hear it pinging off metal in the darkness. The Ghost Boy is said to be a child who died at the curve, though the details of his death vary depending on who is telling the story. Some say he drowned in the brook after a car accident. Others claim he was struck by a vehicle while walking along the road. A few versions suggest something darker, a deliberate act rather than an accident. What remains consistent across decades of retellings is that the boy is young, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, and that he returns the coins as if playing a game, as if he is lonely and grateful for the interaction, even from strangers who come seeking thrills. Jennifer Markowski, who grew up in West Milford in the 1980s, remembers her first encounter with the Ghost Boy legend when she was 16. She and 3 friends drove to Clinton Road on a Friday night in October of 1987, armed with flashlights and a pocket full of quarters. They stopped at the bridge over Clinton Brook just before midnight. The night was cold and clear, she recalls, with enough moonlight to see the dark water moving below. One of her friends threw a quarter into the creek. They waited. Nothing happened. Then someone suggested they had the wrong curve, so they drove farther up the road to the S-curve everyone talked about. This time, Jennifer herself tossed a quarter out the window into the trees. She remembers the exact moment, standing outside the car in the cold, listening to the absolute silence of the woods. Then they heard it, a metallic ping against the car's hood. All 4 of them saw the quarter lying there, glinting in the headlights. They scrambled back into the car and sped away, convinced it must have bounced off a tree and landed there by chance, but none of them could quite shake the feeling that something had indeed thrown it back. But the Ghost Boy is only one thread in the tapestry of strangeness woven around Clinton Road. Over the years, dozens of people have reported phantom vehicles on this isolated stretch. The most common account involves a pickup truck that appears suddenly in the rearview mirror, driving aggressively close, high beams blazing. Drivers naturally speed up or pull over to let the truck pass, but it never passes. It maintains the same threatening distance, tailgating relentlessly. Then, at some point along the road, it simply vanishes. One moment it is there, filling the mirrors with light, and the next moment the road behind is empty and dark. Michael Santos experienced this phenomenon in 2003 while driving home to West Milford after a late shift. He is a practical man, a contractor who has lived in the area his entire life and has driven Clinton Road hundreds of times. On this particular night, around 2 in the morning, he noticed headlights behind him near the reservoir. The vehicle closed the distance quickly, coming right up on his bumper. Santos slowed down, expecting it to pass, but it stayed locked in position behind him. He accelerated to 50 miles per hour, dangerous on that twisting road, and the lights kept pace. Annoyed and a little unnerved, he finally pulled over onto a narrow shoulder, fully stopped his truck, and waited for the other vehicle to go by. The headlights behind him were brilliant, illuminating the interior of his truck. He watched in his side mirror, waiting. The light stayed motionless for perhaps 10 seconds, then they were gone. Not fading into the distance, not turning around. Just gone, as if someone had flipped a switch. Santos sat there for a long moment before pulling back onto the road. The rest of his drive home was uneventful, but he avoids Clinton Road after dark now if he can help it. Then, there are the creatures. Clinton Road has its share of reports that veer from ghostly to cryptozoological. People describe seeing large dark figures crossing the road on 2 legs, too tall and strangely proportioned to be human. These sightings date back to the 1970s and continue to the present day. Some witnesses use the term Bigfoot, though most simply describe something they cannot categorize. The creatures are typically seen in the periphery of headlights, moving with unsettling speed from the tree line across the road and back into the forest on the other side. There are also reports of hellhounds, or demon dogs, as some locals call them. These are described as abnormally large canines, sometimes with glowing eyes, sometimes simply too big and too aggressive to be normal animals. In 1996, a couple driving through on a summer evening nearly collided with what they described as a massive black dog standing in the middle of the road. The animal, they said, was easily the size of a small bear, with a broad head and eyes that reflected red in the headlights. It stared at their car for several seconds before loping into the woods. They reported the incident to local police, who suggested they had seen a black bear, but both witnesses insisted it was canine, not ursine. Adding to the sinister atmosphere is the presence of the Cross Castle ruins. Tucked back in the woods off Clinton Road, accessible by an overgrown trail, stand the remains of what locals call a castle, though it was actually a large stone structure built in the early 20th century by a wealthy businessman named Richard Cross. The building was never completed and was eventually abandoned. By the 1970s, it had become a magnet for teenagers, occultists, and curiosity seekers. The ruins have a Gothic quality, stone walls rising unexpectedly from the forest floor, empty windows like vacant eye sockets staring at visitors. The Cross Castle has its own collection of legends. People claim to have seen robed figures conducting rituals there, though it is hard to separate genuine reports from embellishment and urban myth. What is documented is that the ruins have been the site of at least 1 death and numerous injuries over the years as trespassers explore the unstable structure. Some visitors report intense feelings of dread when approaching the castle, a sense of being watched or actively unwanted. Photographs taken there sometimes show strange lights or shadows that were not visible to the naked eye. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, Clinton Road gained notoriety beyond the local area. It appeared on paranormal television shows and in online forums dedicated to haunted locations. This attention brought waves of thrill seekers, further cementing its reputation. With more visitors came more stories, creating a feedback loop where expectation and experience blur together. Yet, there are accounts from people who had no knowledge of Clinton Road's reputation when they encountered something strange there. In 2009, a woman from Pennsylvania was using GPS to navigate back to the highway after visiting a friend in West Milford. The GPS directed her down Clinton Road, which she had never heard of. It was around 9 at night in early March, dark and cold. About halfway through, her car began to overheat. She pulled over, popped the hood, and called for roadside assistance. While waiting, sitting in her car with the hazard lights on, she became aware of movement in the trees. At first, she thought it was deer, but the shapes were wrong. She described seeing several dark figures moving parallel to the road, keeping pace with her position. They seemed to be watching her. She turned on her high beams, but the figures stayed just beyond the reach of the light. When the tow truck finally arrived 40 minutes later, the driver asked her why she had stopped on Clinton Road of all places. She had no idea what he meant until he began telling her the stories. She now believes she was very fortunate that her car issue was minor, and that help arrived when it did. What makes Clinton Road particularly fascinating from a psychological and folklore perspective is this layering effect. It is not one haunting, one story, but an accumulation. The ghost boy, The phantom vehicles, the creatures, the castle ruins, each thread reinforces the others. When a place acquires a reputation for strangeness, it begins to collect stories like a magnet collects iron filings. Some of these stories are undoubtedly exaggerated or fabricated. Some may be genuine experiences interpreted through the lens of expectation. But underneath it all are the documented facts. The road is genuinely isolated and dangerous. People have genuinely died there, and the landscape itself has a presence that is hard to ignore. There is something about driving through dense forest at night, alone, with no cell phone reception and no lights except your own, that awakens primal fear. Our ancestors feared the dark forest for good reason. Predators lived there. Getting lost meant death. In our modern world, we have largely eliminated these dangers, but the instinct remains. Clinton Road taps into that ancient wariness. Whether the phenomena reported there are supernatural or psychological, the fear they generate is real. The headlights of your car sweep across the darkening forest as you pull into the roadside viewing area along Highway 45 in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. It's just past dusk, and already there are 3 other vehicles here, their occupants standing outside, facing north toward the distant valley. They're silent, expectant, waiting for something that has appeared in this exact spot with such regularity that the U.S. Forest Service erected an official observation site complete with a historical marker. You're here to witness what locals have simply called the Paulding Light, a phenomenon that has defied explanation for more than 6 decades and transformed this remote stretch of road into one of the most documented sites of unexplained activity in the American Midwest. The light, when it appears, begins as a small pinpoint in the distance, hovering above the old power line road that cuts through the valley below. Witnesses describe it consistently across generations. First, a faint glow, barely distinguishable from a distant porch light, or perhaps a star sitting unusually low on the horizon. Then it brightens, shifting from white to red, sometimes to green, pulsing with an irregular rhythm that seems almost organic. It moves laterally across the field of vision, sometimes approaching, sometimes retreating, occasionally splitting into multiple lights that dance independently before merging again. On particularly active nights, the light appears to rush directly toward observers before vanishing completely, only to reappear moments later in its original position. The most unsettling aspect isn't the light itself, but its predictability. This isn't a phenomenon that appears once in a lifetime to a single witness who struggles to convince skeptical friends. The Paulding Light appears almost nightly, visible to anyone who makes the journey to this specific viewing area north of Watersmeet, Michigan. Families bring their children. Tourists add it to their Upper Peninsula itineraries alongside waterfalls and historical copper mines. The Forest Service maintains the site not as a curiosity or a joke, but as a legitimate point of interest, acknowledging by their very infrastructure that something observable happens here with enough consistency to warrant public access. The historical marker at the site recounts the most popular legends surrounding the lights. According to local folklore, the glow represents the lantern of a railroad brakeman who died on these tracks decades ago. In this version of the story, the man was crushed between 2 coupling cars while attempting to signal an approaching train. His ghost, still dedicated to his duty even in death, continues to walk the old railway corridor, swinging his signal lantern in warning. Some versions claim he's searching for his head, separated from his body in the accident. Others insist he's trying to prevent another tragedy, forever attempting to warn a train that will never arrive about danger that has already passed. Alternative explanations draw from older histories. The Ottawa and Chippewa peoples inhabited this region long before European settlement, and some local traditions attribute the lights to Native American spirits dancing in the valley, celebrating or mourning or simply existing in a space between worlds. These explanations carry particular weight in the Upper Peninsula, where the boundary between indigenous sacred sites and settler geography remains thin and contested. The forest here feels ancient in a way that younger American landscapes do not. The trees grow dense and close, the winters stretch impossibly long, and the darkness, when it comes, arrives absolute and total. Over the decades, as the Paulding Light gained reputation and notoriety, researchers arrived with instruments and hypotheses. A group from Michigan Tech University, conducted one of the more rigorous investigations in 2010. They brought telescopes, spectrometers, and methodical observation protocols. Their conclusion, published and disseminated to local media, attributed the lights to vehicle headlights from Highway 45, which runs parallel to the valley several miles to the north. According to their analysis, atmospheric conditions in the valley create a kind of natural lens, magnifying and distorting distant car lights, making them appear closer and more mysterious than their mundane source would suggest. The explanation is neat, scientifically plausible, and utterly fails to satisfy those who have spent significant time observing the phenomenon. Longtime residents point out that the lights were reported consistently throughout the 1960s and 70s, when traffic on the distant highway was sparse at best, particularly during the late-night hours when the lights appear most active. Others note that the lights sometimes move in patterns inconsistent with traffic flow, appearing to travel perpendicular to the highway rather than along it. Observers have reported seeing the lights on nights when they've confirmed the distant highway is closed for construction or weather. The scientific explanation accounts for some sightings, perhaps even most, but the edges remain ragged, the mystery incompletely solved. What transforms the palliding light from a curiosity into something more psychologically compelling is the sheer volume of witnesses. This isn't a legend passed down through generations, growing more elaborate with each retelling. This is an ongoing, observable event that anyone can attempt to witness. The phenomenon democratizes the paranormal experience, removing the barrier of belief. You don't need to trust someone else's testimony or suspend your skepticism. You can drive to the viewing area yourself, wait in the darkness with strangers, and see whatever appears in that valley with your own eyes. The light doesn't care whether you believe in ghosts or reject all supernatural explanations. It appears regardless, indifferent to your framework for understanding reality. Now shift your attention south, more than 1,000 miles from Michigan's forests to the flat, humid landscape of northeastern Arkansas. Here, along Highway 365, near the town of Jacksonville, a different kind of observable phenomenon has troubled road crews and local residents for decades. This mystery doesn't involve distant lights or atmospheric tricks. Instead, it manifests as something more visceral and more disturbing, a dark stain on the pavement that returns again and again, despite every attempt to erase it. The story begins with a motorcycle accident, the details of which vary depending on who's telling it. Most versions agree on the basic framework. A young man, riding his motorcycle along Highway 365, sometime in the late 1970s or early 1980s, lost control of his vehicle and crashed violently on a particular stretch of road. The impact was catastrophic. The rider died at the scene, and a significant amount of blood soaked into the asphalt at the exact point of impact. Tragic, certainly, but not unusual in the catalog of highway fatalities that mark American roads with invisible memorials. What happened next elevates this story from tragedy to legend. According to numerous accounts from Arkansas Highway Department employees, the blood stain from this accident refused to disappear. Standard cleaning procedures had no effect. The dark mark remained visible on the pavement, a grim reminder of the life lost there. This alone might not seem particularly mysterious. Blood and other organic materials can stain asphalt, and weather and time would eventually fade such marks. But road crews began to notice something that defied their professional experience and understanding. The stain would reappear after being scrubbed away. Workers would spend hours cleaning the affected section of highway, using industrial solvents and high-pressure water, removing every trace of the discoloration. Days later, sometimes just hours later, the stain would return, precisely the same size and shape, in exactly the same location. Supervisors, assuming their crews had done incomplete work, would order more thorough cleaning. The results remained identical. The stain always came back. As word spread among highway department personnel, the phenomenon took on an escalating quality. If cleaning couldn't eliminate the stain, perhaps resurfacing would. Road crews laid fresh asphalt over the affected area, a new layer of pavement that should have buried the old stain permanently beneath inches of new material. Within weeks, witnesses reported seeing the dark mark reappearing on the new surface, bleeding up through the fresh asphalt like oil rising through water. This defied basic physics and materials science. Blood cannot migrate vertically through solid asphalt. And yet, multiple crew members, pragmatic men and women whose jobs involved working with roads and pavement daily, reported seeing exactly this impossible phenomenon. The accounts from highway workers carry particular weight because these are not people predisposed to supernatural explanations. Road crew members are, by profession, practical and mechanically minded. They work with concrete, asphalt, machinery, and measurement. Their testimonies, documented in local newspaper articles from the 1980s and 90s, convey genuine bewilderment. These were individuals confronting something that contradicted their professional expertise and material understanding of how roads and stains and physics should work. Some crews reportedly refused to work on that section of highway after dark. Others claimed that attempts to remove the stain were followed by equipment malfunctions and minor accidents. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to create an atmosphere of unease around this particular stretch of pavement. The stain became a known quantity among Arkansas Highway Department employees, a problem without solution, eventually acknowledged informally as something to be worked around rather than resolved. Skeptical explanations exist, of course. Petroleum products in the asphalt might create a recurring discoloration that resembles the original stain. Underground water flow could bring contaminants to the surface repeatedly. Pareidolia, the human tendency to see meaningful patterns in random stimuli, might cause observers to interpret ordinary road wear as the return of the legendary stain. Each explanation addresses part of the mystery, but struggles to account for the specificity of the reports. Why always the same shape? Why the same location across multiple resurfacings? Why the consistent testimony from different crew members across different years? What connects the Paulding Light and the Arkansas Bloodstain, beyond their highway settings, is their physical persistence. These aren't stories told around campfires about events that happened once to someone else. These are phenomena that allegedly continue to manifest, available for observation, challenging witnesses to reconcile what they see with what they believe possible. The escalation is deliberate, a progression from abstract spookiness to concrete claim. The Paulding Light invites you to watch and interpret. The bloodstain insists on its presence despite direct attempts to eliminate it, suggesting that some marks once made cannot be erased by any physical means. Both phenomena also reveal something about how we process and respond to the unexplained. When faced with events that contradict our understanding of how the world works, we construct explanations, scientific or supernatural, that restore coherence to our experience. The Paulding Light becomes headlights or becomes a ghost, depending on which explanation preserves your worldview. The bloodstain becomes petroleum seepage or becomes a restless spirit, whichever allows you to drive past it without questioning the foundations of reality. What happens in these liminal highway spaces challenges the boundary between the explicable and the impossible, forcing travelers and workers alike to choose which framework will contain their experience. And sometimes, late at night on an empty highway, that choice feels less certain than we'd like to believe. There is a place on Interstate 4 in Florida where the highway itself seems to remember death. Between mile marker 44 and 45, just north of the St. Johns River Bridge in Seminole County, a half-mile stretch of asphalt cuts through one of the most accident-prone sections of road in the entire United States. Locals have given it a name that requires no explanation once you understand what lies beneath. They call it the I-4 Dead Zone. The story begins not with modern highway construction, but in the autumn of 1886, when German immigrants arrived in Central Florida seeking new opportunities in a harsh and unforgiving landscape. They established a small settlement near what was then wilderness, building modest homes and cultivating the difficult soil. What they could not have anticipated was the invisible killer that traveled with them. A cholera outbreak swept through the settlement with devastating speed, claiming victims faster than the survivors could properly enter them. Within weeks, an entire community was decimated. The dead were buried quickly in a mass grave, their wooden markers simple and temporary, placed there by grief-stricken survivors who themselves might not live to see another season. The settlement was abandoned. The forest reclaimed the land. And for nearly 80 years, the dead rested undisturbed in their forgotten cemetery, their graves unmarked, except by the slow growth of Spanish moss and palmetto. Then came progress. In the 1960s, as Florida's population exploded and tourism transformed the state into a destination for millions, planners drew lines on maps for an ambitious highway system. Interstate 4 would connect Tampa to Daytona Beach, cutting directly through the heart of Central Florida. The route they chose, whether through ignorance or indifference, ran straight through the old cemetery ground. According to historical records and testimony from construction workers who were there, the graves were supposed to be relocated. The bodies were meant to be exhumed, identified if possible, and moved to consecrated ground with proper ceremony. But multiple sources claim this never happened. Some say the construction company, already behind schedule and over budget, simply paved over the cemetery. Others suggest that the graves were so deteriorated and unmarked that workers genuinely did not realize what lay beneath the soil they were grading and covering with asphalt. A third version of the story, whispered among highway workers for decades, claims that some graves were moved, but many were not. That bones were found during construction and quietly disposed of. That the company feared the delays and bad publicity that would come from acknowledging they had built a highway through a graveyard. Whatever the truth, by 1963, Interstate 4 was open to traffic. And almost immediately, that specific half-mile section began claiming lives. Lieutenant Marcus Webb spent 22 years with the Florida Highway Patrol before retiring in 2009. 15 of those years were spent patrolling the stretch of I-4 that includes the dead zone. When interviewed about his experiences, his usual professional demeanor falters. He describes responding to accidents in that area multiple times per week, sometimes multiple times per day. Accidents that should not happen. Single vehicle crashes on clear days with perfect visibility. Multi-car pileups with no apparent cause. Cars that simply drift off the road as if the driver had fallen asleep. Except, the driver will swear they were fully alert one moment and in the median the next. Webb recalls one incident that still troubles him. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March of 2004. Clear skies, light traffic. A minivan carrying a family of 4 suddenly swerved across 3 lanes of traffic and crashed into the concrete barrier. When Webb arrived on scene, the driver, a woman from Orlando, was uninjured but deeply shaken. She kept repeating the same thing over and over. She had seen a woman in an old-fashioned dress standing on the shoulder of the highway. The figure had been looking directly at her. When the driver turned her head for just a second to confirm what she was seeing, her hands apparently jerked the wheel. By the time she looked back at the road, she was already spinning out of control. Webb walked the entire shoulder. There was no one there. No evidence anyone had ever been there. This was not an isolated report. Webb estimates he personally spoke to at least 30 drivers over the years who claimed to have seen figures on the roadside in the dead zone. Always in the same area. Always described similarly. Men, women, sometimes children. Dressed in clothing from another era. Standing impossibly close to high-speed traffic. Sometimes watching the cars pass. Sometimes appearing to reach out toward the vehicles. And then, when drivers look again, they vanish. The electronic malfunctions are even more consistent. Jennifer Krause has commuted through the dead zone 5 days a week for 8 years, traveling from her home in Deltona to her office in Orlando. She has replaced her cell phone 4 times, convinced each time that the phone itself was defective. It was only when she mentioned the problem to a coworker that she learned about the pattern. Her phones do not malfunction everywhere. They malfunction in the dead zone. The screen freezes. Apps close unexpectedly. Sometimes the phone will restart on its own. Her car radio behaves similarly, switching stations without input, producing static on frequencies that normally come in clear, occasionally going completely silent, even though the display shows it is still powered on. Krause is not unique. Online forums dedicated to Interstate 4 are filled with similar testimony. Truck drivers report their CB radios erupting with static in that specific stretch. GPS systems freeze or display incorrect locations. Dashboard electronics flicker. One semi-truck driver, who requested his name not be used, described his truck's computer system completely shutting down while he was traveling through the dead zone at 70 miles per hour. The engine continued running, but every electronic display went dark. He coasted to the shoulder in terror, convinced he was about to lose control of 40 tons of vehicle and cargo. As soon as he crossed beyond the half-mile marker, Everything came back online at once, as if someone had flipped a switch. In 2004, a transportation researcher named Dr. Patricia Hillman conducted an extensive analysis of accident data for the entire Interstate 4 corridor. What she found defied easy explanation. The half-mile stretch between mile markers 44 and 45 had an accident rate nearly 4 times higher than the highway average. This might be explained by road design, sightlines, or traffic patterns. But when Hillman controlled for all those variables, comparing the dead zone to sections of I-4 with similar curves, similar traffic volume, and similar speed limits, the statistical anomaly remained. There was no engineering reason for the elevated accident rate. The road itself was not particularly dangerous. Yet, people kept crashing there with predictable, horrifying regularity. Hillman's report noted something else disturbing. The types of accidents were unusual. A disproportionate number were single-vehicle crashes, where the driver reported no mechanical failure and could not explain what had caused them to lose control. Many involved drivers who claimed to have experienced sudden, overwhelming disorientation or emotional distress. One driver described it as feeling like he was being pushed off the road by an invisible force. Another said she was overwhelmed by such intense sadness that she began crying uncontrollably and did not realize she had drifted into another lane until she heard horns blaring. The sense of dread that drivers report is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the dead zone phenomenon. This is not the natural caution that comes from knowing you are driving through a dangerous area. People describe it as something that settles over them like a physical weight. A coldness that has nothing to do with air temperature. A feeling of being watched by hostile eyes. An urgent primal need to get out of that space as quickly as possible. Michael Torres drives a delivery truck for a major shipping company. His route takes him through the dead zone twice daily. He has felt it every single time for 3 years. He describes it as a transition. As he approaches mile marker 44 from the south, the ordinary anxiety of highway driving intensifies. By the time he crosses into the dead zone proper, his heart is racing. His hands grip the wheel tighter. He finds himself checking his mirrors obsessively, certain that something is wrong, that danger is imminent, even though he can see clearly that traffic is flowing normally. The feeling peaks somewhere in the middle of the half-mile stretch. Then, as he crosses mile marker 45, it releases all at once. The relief, he says, is so intense that he has occasionally felt lightheaded from it. Torres is analytical about his experience. He does not believe in ghosts. He has tried to rationalize the sensation. Perhaps it is confirmation bias. He knows the stories, so he expects to feel afraid, and his mind manufactures the fear. But he cannot explain why the feeling is so geographically precise. Why it begins and ends at almost exactly the same points every single time. Or why it happens even on days when he is not thinking about the dead zone at all, when his mind is occupied with work schedules or family concerns, and the dread still rises right on cue as he crosses that invisible boundary. Paranormal investigators have been drawn to the dead zone for decades. They bring electromagnetic field detectors that spike inexplicably in the area. They capture photographs with unexplained anomalies. They record audio that seems to contain voices beneath the highway noise. Skeptics dismiss these findings as the result of suggestion and faulty equipment. The electromagnetic interference could be from power lines or cell towers. The voices could be radio bleed or misinterpreted mechanical sounds. The photographs could show dust, insects, or lens flares. But skepticism cannot explain away the accident statistics. It cannot account for the consistency of the reports across decades and across thousands of independent witnesses who have no connection to each other. It cannot rationalize why this specific half-mile of highway, engineered to the same standards as every other mile of Interstate 4, the dead beneath the asphalt, if they are indeed still there, have never been officially acknowledged. There has never been a comprehensive archaeological survey of the area. No ground-penetrating radar study to confirm or deny the presence of human remains. The state of Florida has never formally investigated whether the 1960s construction crews actually relocated the graves as they were supposed to. That information, if it exists in company records or state archives, has never been made public. What remains is a haunted highway that continues to function as a major transportation artery. Over 150,000 vehicles travel through the dead zone every day. Most drivers pass through without incident, unaware of the history beneath them or the reports of those who came before. But the accidents continue. The malfunctions persist. And those who have felt the presence in that half-mile stretch carry the memory of it long after they have reached their destination. They remember the coldness, the dread, the certainty that something was watching them from a place between the living world and whatever lies beyond. And they remember the relief of crossing that final marker and leaving the dead zone behind, at least until the next time their route takes them back through that stretch of road where the dead have never truly rested and may never forgive the disturbance of their graves. Before the interstates carved their endless ribbons across America, before the concrete and asphalt buried what lay beneath, the land remembered. It always remembers. When we tell stories of phantom hitchhikers and ghostly figures on dark highways, we are speaking, perhaps unconsciously, about a deeper truth. The roads we travel every day are built upon layers of history, tragedy, and sacred ground that was never meant to be disturbed. The interstate highway system stands as one of America's greatest engineering achievements. President Dwight Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act into law in 1956, unleashing the largest public works project the nation had ever seen. Over the next 4 decades, 46,000 miles of highway would slice through mountains, span rivers, tunnel under cities, and fundamentally reshape the American landscape. The goals were noble enough: connect the country, facilitate commerce, enable rapid military deployment in case of invasion. But in the rush to build, in the fever of post-war expansion and automobile culture, little thought was given to what lay beneath. The construction crews who broke ground on these massive projects were focused on grades and curves, on drainage and foundation strength. They consulted geological surveys and topographical maps. What they rarely consulted were historical records, tribal territories, or the living memory of communities who knew what ground was sacred and what places carried weight. Route 66 offers perhaps the most haunting example of this historical layering. The Mother Road, as John Steinbeck called it, became an icon of American freedom and westward migration. Travelers still seek out its remaining stretches, photographing vintage motels and abandoned gas stations with nostalgic reverence. But significant portions of Route 66 follow the path of the Trail of Tears, the route along which thousands of Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw people were forcibly marched from their ancestral homelands in the 1830s. It was a death march. Families walked through winter cold and summer heat, inadequately clothed and fed. Children died in their mothers' arms. Elders collapsed by the roadside. Estimates suggest that 4,000 Cherokee alone perished during the removal, their bodies often buried in hastily dug graves along the route, or simply left where they fell. When highway engineers laid asphalt over these trails in the 1920s and 30s, they were paving over graves, over the footprints of genocide, over soil soaked with tears and blood. Indigenous communities tried to speak up, tried to explain the significance of these routes, but their voices carried little weight in an era of unrestrained development. The pavement went down regardless. Dr. Angela Gonzalez, a historian specializing in Native American studies, has documented dozens of cases where highway construction deliberately or negligently destroyed sacred sites. She notes that the legal framework of the 1950s and 60s offered virtually no protection for indigenous burial grounds or ceremonial locations, especially when they stood in the path of federal infrastructure projects. Tribal communities could protest, but they had little legal standing to halt construction. The result was a systematic erasure, layer by layer, as bulldozers scraped away not just earth, but memory itself. Interstate 40, which eventually replaced much of Route 66, continued this pattern. In Oklahoma, sections of the highway cut directly through documented Cherokee campsites from the removal era. In Arkansas, construction crews unearthed remains but were under such pressure to maintain schedules that proper archaeological protocols were rarely followed. Bones were often reburied elsewhere, or, in some cases, simply covered over and paved. The thinking was brutally pragmatic. The highway must go through, and the dead have no voice to object. But it wasn't only Native American sites that fell beneath the interstates. The Civil War left scars across the American South and border states, and many of these scarred places found themselves in the path of highway development. Interstate 81, runs through Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, site of numerous Civil War engagements. The Battle of Cedar Creek, the Battle of New Market, skirmishes and ambushes that left fields soaked with blood. Local historians estimate that thousands of soldiers, both Union and Confederate, were buried in unmarked graves throughout the valley. Many of these graves were never properly documented. When highway construction began in the 1960s, workers regularly uncovered human remains, uniform buttons, belt buckles, and other artifacts. The official policy was to note the findings and continue work. Pennsylvania's highways tell similar stories. Interstate 76, the Pennsylvania Turnpike, crosses through areas where fierce fighting occurred during the Gettysburg Campaign. Construction in the 1930s and 40s disturbed numerous burial sites. Workers reported finding bones, weaponry, and personal effects. Some of these discoveries made local newspapers. Most did not. The remains were cataloged when possible, but the imperative to complete the highway took precedence over archaeological or historical preservation. The disruption of existing cemeteries presents another troubling chapter in highway construction history. In many cases, particularly in urban areas or along established routes, highways were deliberately routed through or adjacent to burial grounds. The logic was often economic. Cemeteries represented land that was already in use but generated no tax revenue and had no residents who could mount political opposition. The dead, after all, don't vote. Chicago's Joliet area provides a stark example. When Interstate 55 was expanded in the 1970s, it required the relocation of hundreds of graves from several small, historically black cemeteries. The process was meant to be respectful, but descendants of those buried there reported that the work was rushed, that remains were mishandled, and that not all graves were successfully relocated before construction equipment moved in. Similar stories emerge from highway projects across the country. In Louisiana, Interstate 10's construction in the 1960s disturbed several small burial grounds dating to the 19th century. In Texas, highway expansion projects in the 1970s and 80s led to the hasty relocation of numerous graves from family plots and small community cemeteries. Dr. Robert Thompson, a folklorist who has studied the intersection of infrastructure and supernatural belief, suggests that our ghost stories often emerge from collective guilt and historical trauma that we haven't fully processed. When communities tell stories about haunted highways, they may be expressing, in the language of folklore, an unease about what was destroyed to build those roads. The phantom hitchhiker who vanishes might represent all those who died unremembered along these routes. The mysterious lights that drivers report could be a manifestation of our cultural anxiety about disturbing the dead. Thompson points to the concept of place memory, the idea that traumatic events become embedded in locations and persist in collective consciousness across generations. This isn't necessarily a supernatural claim, but rather an observation about how communities remember and transmit historical knowledge. A curve in the road where murders occurred might be remembered as dangerous or unlucky, and that association persists even after the original events fade from conscious recollection. Stories evolve, details change, but the core sense that this place carries weight remains. Indigenous perspectives on this phenomenon run much deeper than Western folklore can capture. Many tribal traditions hold that land itself is alive and conscious, that it bears witness to what occurs upon it. When sacred sites are disrupted, when burial grounds are desecrated, the injury isn't just to the physical remains, but to the spiritual integrity of the place itself. Mary Lyons, a Lakota elder and cultural preservation advocate, has spent decades documenting how highway construction has impacted sacred sites across the Great Plains. She describes visiting locations where interstates now run over what were once Vision Quest sites, Sundance grounds, and burial scaffolds. The highways didn't just cover these places, she argues. They severed the living relationship between people and land that had existed for thousands of years. The rapidity of highway construction compounded the problem. The interstate highway system wasn't built gradually over centuries. It erupted across the landscape in just a few decades, reshaping the country at a pace that left little time for reflection or careful consideration. Engineering priorities dominated every decision. Could the grade be achieved? Would the foundation support the expected traffic loads? How quickly could the segment be completed? Questions about historical significance, cultural sensitivity, or spiritual importance rarely factored into project planning. Some of the most disturbing examples involve execution grounds and sites of violence that were simply paved over. In several southern states, highways run directly over or adjacent to locations where lynchings occurred. These sites were rarely marked or memorialized, and their existence was often known only to local communities, particularly within Black populations who carried the traumatic memory of racial terror. Highway planners consulting official maps and property records would have had no indication that these locations held such dark significance. But the communities remembered, and they passed down stories that sometimes manifested as haunting narratives. A stretch of road, known for mysterious accidents. A particular overpass where drivers reported unsettling presences. These stories functioned as a form of memory, keeping alive an awareness of historical trauma even when official history remained silent. The expansion of existing highways in later decades continued these patterns. When Interstate 270 was constructed around St. John, Louis in the 1960s and 70s, portions of the route cut through areas that had been execution grounds in the 19th century. Local historical societies documented these sites, but the information rarely reached highway planners, or if it did, had little impact on routing decisions. Similarly, several highways in the Northeast run over or near former potters' fields, where the unclaimed dead, the poor, the marginalized were buried in unmarked graves. These burial grounds were often poorly documented, their locations lost to official records even if local memory preserved them. The environmental impact studies that began to be required in the 1970s marked a shift toward greater awareness, but even these rarely accounted for cultural or historical concerns, unless they involved properties already on the National Register of Historic Places. Burial grounds had to be officially documented to receive protection. Sacred sites needed formal recognition. For indigenous communities, for African American populations, for immigrant groups whose historical presence was often erased from official records, this meant their losses continued largely unacknowledged. Today, as we drive these highways at 70 miles per hour, the history beneath the pavement remains largely invisible. But it hasn't disappeared. It persists in the stories we tell, in the unease we feel at certain locations, in the persistent reports of strange experiences along particular stretches of road. When we investigate these highway hauntings, we're often uncovering layers of genuine historical tragedy. The ghost stories, in their own way, are doing the work that official history failed to do. They're remembering what was lost, marking what was destroyed, and insisting that some places, some events, some injustices cannot simply be paved over and forgotten. The roads remember, because we remember, even when we're not fully conscious of what we're remembering, or why certain places still disturb us as we pass through them in the dark. The headlights cut through darkness like twin beams searching for something they'll never find, and the highway stretches endlessly ahead, white lines disappearing into the vanishing point where the road meets the night sky. Mile after mile, the landscape blurs into sameness. The rumble strips hum their monotonous song. Your eyes grow heavy, then suddenly you jolt awake, realizing you have no memory of the last 10 miles you just drove. This moment, this gap in consciousness, represents one of the most common, yet least understood experiences of highway travel. It's called highway hypnosis, and it might explain far more than just lost time on the road. Dr. Eleanor Vance has spent the past 15 years studying altered states of consciousness during routine activities. She sits in her office at the university, surrounded by brain scan images and sleep study data, explaining what happens to our minds when we surrender to the rhythm of the road. The phenomenon, she says, was first formally identified in 1957 by a researcher named G.W. Williams, who noticed that drivers could enter a trance-like state during monotonous highway driving. The brain, seeking to conserve energy during repetitive tasks, begins to operate on a kind of autopilot. The conscious mind drifts while the subconscious handles the mechanical process of steering, accelerating, and maintaining lane position. During this state, drivers can experience what scientists call microphasic sleep events, brief moments where the brain dips into sleep patterns while the body continues performing automated tasks. But highway hypnosis doesn't just steal time. It fundamentally alters perception. Dr. Vance explains that during these trance states, the brain's visual processing system becomes highly suggestible. The peripheral vision, which normally helps us navigate and detect movement, begins to misfire. Shadows become figures. Tree branches reaching over the roadway transform into grasping hands. The play of headlights against fog creates shapes that seem to move with intention and intelligence. The mind, desperate for stimulation in an environment of crushing monotony, begins to manufacture it. This brings us to pareidolia, the psychological phenomenon where our brains perceive familiar patterns in random or ambiguous stimuli. It's why we see faces in clouds, why the moon seems to watch us with human eyes, why a piece of burnt toast might resemble a religious figure. Our brains are pattern recognition machines, honed by millions of years of evolution to detect predators in the brush, friends in a crowd, and meaning in chaos. On a dark highway, with vision limited to the cone of light provided by headlights and consciousness already altered by highway hypnosis, pareidolia goes into overdrive. Dr. Marcus Chen, a neuropsychologist specializing in perception science, has conducted experiments specifically examining how the brain processes visual information during night driving. He set up a driving simulator and tracked subjects' eye movements and brain activity over extended periods. What he found was remarkable. After just 30 minutes of simulated night driving, test subjects began reporting seeing things that weren't there. A crumpled bag beside the road became a crouching animal. Reflective road signs created the illusion of distant lights approaching. Random arrangements of trees suggested human forms standing just beyond the shoulder. The brain's visual cortex, Chen explains, doesn't simply receive images like a camera. It predicts what it expects to see based on context and past experience, then fills in gaps using those predictions. When you're tired, when you're isolated, when you're driving through unfamiliar territory with a head full of stories about haunted highways, your brain's prediction engine starts making mistakes. It predicts threats because threats keep you alert. It predicts the supernatural because you're half expecting it. And what the brain predicts, the brain often perceives, at least in those crucial first moments before rational analysis can correct the error. Sleep deprivation amplifies all of these effects exponentially. Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, a sleep researcher who has studied the effects of fatigue on long-haul truck drivers, describes sleep deprivation as a gateway to hallucination. After roughly 18 hours of continuous wakefulness, the average person's cognitive function becomes equivalent to someone with a blood alcohol content of 0.05%. After 24 hours without sleep, that impairment doubles. But the effects go beyond simple impairment. The sleep-deprived brain begins to experience intrusions from REM sleep, the dream state, while the person remains technically awake. These intrusions manifest as visual hallucinations, auditory distortions, and profound disturbances in the perception of time and space. Okonkwo recounts the testimony of a truck driver she interviewed during her research, a man who had been driving for 22 hours straight, pushing through to make a delivery deadline. He reported seeing a woman in a white dress standing in the middle of the highway. He swerved, felt the truck fishtail, fought to regain control. When he finally brought the vehicle to a stop and looked back, there was nothing there. No woman. No evidence anyone had been standing on that stretch of road. His brain, desperate for sleep, had inserted a dream image into his waking perception. The woman in white he saw was as real to him in that moment as the steering wheel in his hands, but she existed only in the misfiring synapses of his exhausted brain. Carbon monoxide exposure represents another physiological factor that can create experiences often interpreted as supernatural. In older vehicles, particularly those with poorly maintained exhaust systems or rust holes in the floor panels, odorless carbon monoxide can seep into the passenger cabin. The gas binds to hemoglobin in the blood more effectively than oxygen, gradually starving the brain of the oxygen it needs to function. Early symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning include confusion, visual disturbances, and hallucinations. The victim feels detached from reality, may see things that aren't there, and experiences profound alterations in their perception of time. Many vintage cars, the kind that enthusiasts love to restore and drive on weekend excursions down historic highways, are particularly susceptible to carbon monoxide infiltration. How many ghost sightings, how many encounters with phantom hitchhikers, might be explained by a simple leak in an exhaust manifold. Environmental psychology offers yet another layer of explanation for why certain locations consistently generate reports of unusual experiences. Dr. Vance describes a study conducted in supposedly haunted buildings where researchers measured electromagnetic fields, infrasound, air quality, and other environmental factors. They found that locations reported as haunted often had unusual electromagnetic fluctuations or exposure to infrasound, sound waves below the threshold of human hearing. Infrasound, typically occurring at frequencies below 20 Hz, can be generated by wind moving through structures, by geological activity, or by heavy machinery. The human eye begins to resonate at its natural frequency when exposed to infrasound around 19 Hz, causing visual distortions, the sensation of something in peripheral vision, and a feeling of unease that people often describe as a presence in the room. On highways, infrasound can be generated by wind passing over the irregular terrain alongside the road, by the rhythmic thump of tires over expansion joints, or by the interaction between the vehicle and the road surface at certain speeds. If you're driving at 65 miles per hour, and the highway has expansion joints spaced at a particular interval, the resulting vibration in sound might create infrasound at exactly the frequency that causes your eyes to vibrate and your nervous system to interpret the sensation as fear. The ghost you see might be nothing more than your own eyeball resonating in its socket, creating visual artifacts that your already primed pattern recognition system interprets as a figure standing on the roadside. The psychology of fear itself plays a crucial role in shaping these experiences. When we're afraid, our bodies flood with adrenaline and cortisol. Our pupils dilate, taking in more light but also reducing our depth perception. Our attention narrows, focusing intently on potential threats while losing awareness of the broader context. Our memory systems shift into high gear, burning the frightening experience into our minds with unusual clarity and detail. This is why traumatic or frightening memories often feel more vivid and real than ordinary recollections. The brain treats them as survival-critical information that must be preserved. Suggestion and expectation shape perception in profound ways. If you drive down a highway knowing its reputation as haunted, knowing the stories of vanishing hitchhikers or spectral accidents, your brain is already primed to interpret ambiguous stimuli in supernatural terms. A piece of trash blowing across the road becomes a phantom figure. The momentary glare of headlights off a reflective surface becomes mysterious lights. The crackle of radio static as you pass under power lines becomes an otherworldly voice trying to communicate. This isn't weakness or foolishness. It's simply how human perception works. We see what we expect to see, especially under conditions of stress, fatigue, and sensory limitation. Yet Dr. Vance is careful to note that understanding the psychology and physiology behind these experiences doesn't necessarily invalidate them. The terror that driver felt was real. The woman he saw was real to him in that moment. The physiological stress, the adrenaline response, the memory burned into his mind, all of these were genuine experiences with genuine effect. Psychology can explain the mechanisms by which the brain generates certain perceptions without explaining every reported experience. Science remains humble before the vast complexity of consciousness and the limits of current understanding. There exists a legitimate middle ground between blind acceptance and dismissive skepticism. Some locations do seem to generate consistent reports of unusual experiences across decades and across witnesses who have no knowledge of previous accounts. Whether this represents something genuinely anomalous or simply a particularly potent combination of environmental factors and psychological priming remains an open question. The scientist's role is not to explain away experiences but to understand them, to identify the factors that contribute to them, and to distinguish between the mechanisms we understand and the mysteries that remain. As the miles disappear beneath your tires and the night presses in around the fragile bubble of light surrounding your vehicle, your mind walks a tightrope between reason and imagination. The highway hypnosis pulls you down into trance. Pareidolia transforms shadows into figures. Fatigue introduces dream logic into waking perception. Fear amplifies every ambiguous stimulus into potential threat. And somewhere in this complex interaction between brain and environment, between expectation and experience, the ghost stories are born. Some can be explained, some cannot. And perhaps that uncertainty, that gap between knowing and unknowing, is where the true haunting lies. There's a moment that happens on every long night drive, usually somewhere on the third or fourth hour, when the white lines start to blur and the darkness beyond your headlights becomes absolute. Your mind begins to wander. The rational part of your brain knows you're on Interstate 70 or Route 66. But there's another part, something older and more primal, that whispers you've crossed into somewhere else entirely. That feeling, that unsettling sense of displacement, is exactly why haunted highway stories continue to thrive in an age when our phones can pinpoint our location to within 3 feet, and artificial intelligence can predict our arrival time down to the minute. We live in a world that has been mapped, measured, and monetized. There are cameras at every intersection and satellites tracking every movement. Yet the American highway, particularly at night, particularly in those long stretches between towns where the only light comes from your dashboard, remains genuinely liminal. It's one of the last spaces in modern life where we're truly alone with our thoughts, suspended between destinations, belonging neither to where we've been nor where we're going. Perhaps that's why we need these stories now more than ever. The persistence of haunted highway folklore tells us something profound about American culture. We're a nation built on movement, on the idea that you can always keep driving towards something better. The open road is embedded in our mythology, from Kerouac to Springsteen, from Route 66 tourism to countless road trip movies. But every mythology needs its shadow side, and our highway ghost stories serve that function. They're the dark mirror to all those songs about freedom and escape, reminding us that not every journey ends well, that some travelers never make it home. Consider what these stories actually do for us. On the surface, they're entertainment, the modern equivalent of campfire tales. But dig deeper, and you'll find they serve as informal memorials, keeping alive the memory of tragedies that official history has forgotten. That phantom hitchhiker on the back road outside of town? She might be the echo of a real young woman who died in 1963, whose story would otherwise be buried in yellowing newspaper archives. The glowing eyes that follow your car through the mountain pass? Perhaps they mark the spot where a family perished in a winter storm, their names known now only to descendants and local historians. These stories are how communities remember their dead when there are no monuments, no plaques, no official recognition. They also function as cautionary tales, though not always in obvious ways. Yes, some warn about drunk driving or dangerous curves or the risks of picking up strangers. But the deeper caution is more existential. These stories remind us that we're not invincible, that the machine we're piloting at 70 miles per hour is powerful and dangerous, that the road demands respect and attention. Every driver knows that moment of sudden clarity when you realize you've been on autopilot for the last 10 miles, your conscious mind elsewhere, while your hands operated the vehicle. It's terrifying. Ghost stories reinforce what safety statistics and warning signs cannot quite convey: that the highway is a threshold space where life and death run parallel, separated by nothing more than painted lines and human attention. What's particularly fascinating is how these stories have adapted to new technology rather than being erased by it. GPS doesn't prevent people from getting lost in the psychological sense. Smartphone connectivity doesn't make you less alone when you're driving through the Nevada desert at 2 in the morning. If anything, our devices make the contrast more stark. You can be streaming music, following turn-by-turn directions, knowing that theoretically you could call for help at any moment, and still feel that ancient dread when your headlights catch something moving at the edge of the road. The technology creates a thin veneer of security that makes the moments when it fails, when your signal drops or your battery dies, even more unsettling. Whether these experiences are supernatural or psychological is, in many ways, beside the point. The unease people feel on certain roads is real. The stories they tell afterward are genuine attempts to articulate something that defied their understanding. When a long-haul trucker swears he saw a woman in a white dress vanish in his rearview mirror, when a family insists they all heard the same child crying from an empty field, when dozens of independent witnesses report the same phantom lights or mysterious figures, something meaningful is happening. Perhaps it's mass psychology, the power of suggestion, the way our pattern-seeking brains construct narratives from ambiguous stimuli. Perhaps it's something we don't yet have the vocabulary or instruments to measure. The experience is valid either way. This is why these stories proliferate and evolve. Each generation adds its own details, its own fears, its own interpretations. The hitchhiker ghost who once wore a poodle skirt now appears in modern clothes. The phantom car, that used to be a Model T, is now a sedan from the 1980s. The stories stay relevant because they're constantly being updated, filtered through new experiences while maintaining their essential core. They're living folklore, as genuine and meaningful as any ancient myth, and they tell us who we are right now. They reveal our complicated relationship with death, particularly sudden, random death. Highway fatalities are statistically predictable, but individually arbitrary. Why did that deer jump in front of one car and not another? Why did the drunk driver cross the median at the exact moment your vehicle was passing? The randomness is intolerable to the human mind, which craves pattern and meaning. Ghost stories provide structure. They transform inexplicable tragedy into narrative. The dangerous curve becomes cursed. The fatal intersection becomes haunted. It doesn't change what happened, but it gives survivors and witnesses a framework for processing events that otherwise feel too chaotic to bear. Every mile of American highway does have a story. Most are mundane, routine commutes, family vacations, truck deliveries that arrived on time. But some miles have absorbed darker histories. Accidents and murders and disappearances. Lives that ended suddenly on asphalt and concrete. And some stories, it seems, refuse to be paved over. They seep up through fresh blacktop. They echo in the wind that buffets your car on exposed ridges. They flicker at the periphery of your vision when you're tired and alone and far from home. The next time you drive a lonely highway at night, you might find yourself understanding why the road feels haunted. Why that particular stretch makes your hands tighten on the wheel. Why you accelerate through certain areas without quite knowing why. Understanding the psychological and cultural mechanisms behind these feelings doesn't make them less compelling. If anything, it makes them more so. Because you're participating in something ancient and human, the same impulse that made our ancestors tell stories around fires, that made travelers leave offerings at crossroads, that makes us need to explain the darkness beyond the light. So drive carefully. Pay attention. Respect the road and the stories it carries. And if you see something you can't quite explain, something that makes the hair rise on your neck and your foot instinctively press the accelerator, well, you're not alone. Countless others have driven this same route and felt this same thing. You're part of a tradition now, a long chain of witnesses and storytellers, keeping alive the mystery at the heart of the American highway. The road stretches ahead into darkness. Your headlights carve a tunnel through the night. And somewhere out there on some forgotten mile marker, the stories wait to be discovered, remembered, and passed on once more. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos